Greetings, YouTube. One of the highlights of my week is the American Roots show that plays on Friday nights. I get to listen to it on the way to work, and then I listen to it before I actually begin my shift. Not that I can't listen to it on, you know, anytime I want to stream it, because, the internet's. Um, and it's a radio show that deals with the history of American music. So it reaches back to the earliest eras of recorded American music. So the early blues and folk and country music, rockabilly, doo-wop. It's a marvelous jazz. It's a marvelous mix of things, and I really thoroughly enjoy it. Off the top of my head, I can't remember the gentleman's name who's the host. And at the moment, I have no internet connection because I can't really look it up quickly. Um, but he's a marvelous host, and he's an excellent interviewer. This Not all radio programs have great interviewers. One of the channels I listen to regularly is WNHN. They do blues and progressive talk. It's a part of the public radio network, and they got a host on Thursday nights who's just painful to listen to. But recently he was playing the host on American Roots was playing a show that they had actually made in 2018, and it involved talking about Jerry Lee Lewis. Now, there's no mistake that Jerry Lee Lewis is probably the greatest rock and roll piano player that ever lived or ever will live. The man had fire in his fingers, okay? But it's also true that he had a very problematic relationship with women. And by very problematic, I say he's a pedophile. Why do I say that? When he was 22 years old, he married a 13-year-old. 13-year-old. That's nauseating, and should not then nor be now legal anywhere in the world to marry a 13-year-old. I personally believe that the age of consent should be universally 16. It's about the right time for that. I think that, and the average marriage age should be 18, just across the board. That would make things so much simpler. But 13, if you're 22 years old and you're interested in a 13-year-old, you're a pedophile. Now, please feel free, if you have an internet connection, go look up the pictures of Jerry Lee Lewis and his bride when they were married, when she was 13 and he was 22. He looks like a man. He looks like a full-blown adult man, though a young one. She looks like a kid, a child. Not a fully blossomed woman, which is how pedophiles like to phrase that. But no, she looks like a child because she was a child. She was 13. And when the news of what he had done reached Europe, it wiped out his tour. He was in Britain at the time on tour when the story broke, and it just ended his tour. And he was crushed by it. He went home very depressed and confused because apparently he didn't understand why they were upset. And not only was he confused by this, but I'm sure his family was. And why do I say that? I say that because during the show that was about Jerry Lee Lewis on American Roots, they interviewed his sister. And she out and out says that there's been a tradition in her family of men marrying young girls. So she's publicly declaring that there has been a tradition in her family of adult men being pedophiles. Because there isn't any way for you to look at the bride of Jerry Lee Lewis when they were married and not see a child. Because if you're seeing a woman, get to a therapist right now. She doesn't look like an adult. There is no question of her age. You would not look at her and think that she's 18. You'd look at her and you'd think she's 11 or 12 years old. You'd be hard-pressed to think she was 13. This goes beyond the fact that not only was she 13, but she was his first cousin. So he married his first cousin and was 13 years old. And his sister seems very comfortable with this. The whole family seemed to be very comfortable with this. The whole community they lived in seemed to be very comfortable with this because they allowed it to go on for who knows how long. I don't know what the age of consent is in the state he was married in right now. I'd probably be disturbed to find out. I don't know what the marriage age is because it doesn't necessarily have to be the same thing. There are places where you can get married to someone who is below the age of consent. Stop and think about that for a second. So there are places where you can marry a child who is below the age of consent. And I'm willing to admit that there's a difference between age of consent and legal maturity. Okay, I understand that. That a person gets to a point where they can make decisions about their own body. I think it's okay. And when they actually become an adult. I understand that there can be a gap in there. But when you're below that age of consent, yeah, you don't get to touch them. You don't get to date them. You don't get to touch them. You don't get to marry them. And then comes along American Roots, a program that I greatly respect, that I have suggested to many people in the past. And their host doesn't seem to think it's weird or even comment about the fact that the person he's talking to thinks it's acceptable for an adult man to marry a child. But the topic of the show he's having, who did in fact marry a child when he was 22, he never brings this up. Now, I got a lot of respect for this dude, but that right there is some blindness to the world at large. You are significantly blind to the dangers of toxic masculinity and just the prevalence of predation on children in our society. But maybe I'm just a crazy for a progressive, thinking that maybe an adult should, marry an adult. I mean, there's a 7 year age gap between my wife and I, but when we got married, she was 33 and I was 40. All right, so that's okay. At 33, she could make the decision to marry me. And while I may question it, I'm glad of it. I don't think it's okay for a 22-year-old to be marrying a 13-year-old. And anyone else that does is twisted.